Good morning. It's Tuesday, March 30th, 2010. We're here in the television studios of California University as part of the Women of Accomplishment program and a series of interviews that are being done with women of accomplishment. And we have today a woman who has accomplished a lot in her life, and that's Colonel Patricia J. McDaniel. We're really happy to have you here today. I'm really anxious for this opportunity to talk to you and share some of your insights into your career, your personal life, your family and educational situations, and try to paint this against the backdrop of American history that so many significant changes were going on. Thanks for being here with us today, and congratulations on all your magnificent accomplishments.
Thank you.
Let's go back and start at the beginning, if you will. How did you get into some of the things that you chose to do in your life? Could you tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and your family situation, and maybe we can see how you pursued some of your choices?
I grew up in Pittsburgh. My father was a police officer and my mother was a homemaker, and I'm the third of 5 children. There were 4 girls and a boy. But I'm about 9 years older than my youngest sibling, who's the boy. So really my family was mostly 4 girls for a long time while I was growing up. And we lived in Beltsuver, which is in the inner city. And I went to Beltsuver Elementary School, where my mother had gone to school, and Knoxville Junior High. Now in those days, and I'm African American, I have out of my 4 grandparents, 3 grandparents were African American and 1 grandparent was white. And of course, I look like I'm white, but as far back as anyone knows on my mother's side, the only white influence was we think from slave days. So we don't know of any white relatives back on my mother's side or ancestors. On my father's side, my father's mother was a white woman. Her parents had immigrated from Poland. And her family disowned her when she married my grandfather. And so growing up then, I did not know of any white relatives. And Beltsuver was a primarily African-American community, so Beltsuver Elementary School was a racially segregated, de facto segregated elementary school. And then Knoxville Junior High is integrated, but still, the way those schools went, that if your neighborhood fed into the school, that entrance became kind of a black entrance, and then the other entrance was a white entrance. And so, even though I appear to be white, I grew up in a neighborhood that my mother had lived in. People knew my family from my mother's side of the family, and so back in those days we were considered colored. I always knew I was colored, and I never really even thought about having looked like I'm white until high school. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, because of the notion of a lot of African Americans of passing. That used to be a term that was used historically back then, as you said, of living a life as if you were white. So what I think you're telling me is that just really never entered your mind back then at all?
That's correct for me. My mother had a brother who passed. My father had a sister who passed. And we saw that, we children. So now my mother's brother was still in touch with the family. He moved away, and my mother's family was interesting because there were 4 children. 2 looked white, 2 looked black. I mean, they weren't dark-skinned or anything, but they obviously were visibly black. And so one of the brothers who could pass, he would still be in touch with the family when he would come back to Pittsburgh. But one brother went to visit him, and he wouldn't even meet with his brother. So that influenced my family because we saw that. And then on my father's side, my father's sister passed. She married a white man and never had any contact with her family again. And so that left a pretty big hole with my dad. To this day, my dad's still alive, and I was talking to him about family history not long ago, and I asked about her. And, you know, you could tell it really hurt him that she left at 17 years old and they've never seen her again.
Your parents still live around here? Your father still?
My father's still alive. My mother passed away a few years ago, and he still lives in the same house that they moved into when I was 6 months old.
By himself?
By himself,
That's
yeah.
amazing, that generation.
Yeah.
So over on top of these things that we've mentioned before the interview, the gender and the race, obviously the family situation in your case was probably a stronger, seems to me to be a stronger influence. Are you still, you're in touch with your father, are you still close with your siblings? Do you still manage to keep in touch with them?
I do see them. I try to get into Pittsburgh. Well, I try to do it a little more frequently than sometimes I do. Some years will pass when it might only be 1 or 2 visits. Some years more often. And I just saw him this past weekend since I came up here. And so I saw a couple of my sisters. I have a couple of sisters who have had an interesting relationship with our racial background. And one of them in particular, she has embraced the, we have some Native American heritage, kind of remote, but it's there. And she's embraced that. Now she has more of a ethnic, we'll say, appearance than I. And so I kind of tease her sometimes because she has the dark, straight hair, and then she'll wear a lot of the Native American attire. So she actually, I mean, she really looks the part. But we did not grow up relating to African or to Native American. We always knew we were, like I said, in those days we were colored. My grandmother was very active in the social side of that community. They have clubs, Jack and Jill clubs, things like that. My grandmother was involved in, and so that we think that's kind of interesting. But
it's very interesting, and as I said, painted against that larger backdrop of history, especially what was going on in the city during the time you were growing up, and all the major changes in the civil rights movement and everything else.
And that touched us because if you know anything about the way African Americans have progressed among ourselves, back in the old days, the lighter you were, that had more of a benefit. You had more privileges, things like that. And then we had the Black Power movement where that became kind of a negative to be as light-skinned as I am. And my father ran into that because he was a police officer, and he was had moved along pretty well. He had faced discrimination as a young man on the Pittsburgh Police Department, and then when he got, and the Pittsburgh Courier, the black paper, was one of his biggest proponents. But then as he got more senior, because he's light-skinned, although my dad would have a hard time passing, he's still very light. The city, and in those days, they really pretty much had a quota system for the higher promotions. So the city wanted someone that they said was more visibly black. And so he faced that too. And I'm sure, you know, the story's told many times over and over, but it really did have an impact on our family. Yeah,
and you just did such a great job of putting all that history in context. As I said, all those changes in the value systems and the way people looked at each other during that civil rights movement that was starting as you were growing up, and sort of coming to a culmination there in the late 60s and early 70s. As I said, your life and your career just parallels so many major things, and that really is significant. We can jump ahead. We could spend the whole hour talking about that, and I would truly enjoy that. What brought you here to California? Was it California State Teachers College? Because that's when I went. It still didn't have the teachers. It was Cal State. Cal State. I know, that's what I was here with. When Cal U now was always Cal State.
Right. My dad, I don't think I wanted to go to college. I've tried to refresh my memory on that because it's been a while. But I remember getting a job in a bakery, and that was my first job. And I told my dad, and my dad was really the strong influence. I told him I was not going to college because he told me I was. And so, of course, everything he said, I had to do the opposite. And he said, oh, yes, you are. And so he filled out an application for me to go to California and Shippensburg. And he filled it out, signed my name, sent it off. And then I got accepted at both the places, and then he did tell me I had to pick one, so I picked California just because of that.
Gave you that choice. That was very nice. I can't imagine him wanting to ship his little girl so far away. Isn't that neat the way parents did things back in those days? That's also another value system there.
That's exactly
wouldn't dare get kids to take you to court and sue you. That's fascinating. So you came here and you just wanted to stay close to home, or was there something about?
No, I like the name. I mean, I had two choices: Shippensburg or California. I thought, well, California sounds pretty interesting, so I picked that.
Well, that was certainly good for us that you chose to come down here. Now, I saw from your biography you were a history major, and
yes.
I was too. So I'm fascinated by that. Why history? Of all the things that would have appealed to you, we didn't have many females as history majors back in that day. Again, there was a gender bias against some things.
I love history. To this day, I just love history. And I did think when I was growing up, and I remember this because I walked to school uphill both ways, and that was true because you go up, down, But
in Pittsburgh,
right? So I remember in elementary school walking to school and thinking about what I wanted to do with my life. And I figured I'd be a teacher because in those days you really didn't have that many options for girls. And my grandmother had been a nurse practitioner briefly, and so I always liked playing with her little pill boxes is what they had in those days. But I knew I didn't want to do that. And then I didn't really know much else that girls could do. So I thought I'd be a teacher, and I loved history, so I thought the best job in the world could be teaching history.
Yes, it is. That is absolutely true. Yes.
And I've always loved that. And so I majored in education when I came here, and then when I joined ROTC, I thought, well, heck, I don't need to teach. I'll just keep the history part and just go ahead and get the bachelor's in history.
Did you? Well, there was a very solid African American history program here at California University during that time. Do you remember taking any of those classes?
I don't remember that even being in existence. So if that was here, that was hidden because I tried to take as many history classes as I could. My electives were even the history classes.
Yeah, well, yeah. They brought in a young man from Philadelphia, Dr. Bauman. And he was...
that name sounds familiar, yes.
Yes, and he handled those, the history and then some of the ancillary things like urban history and all that.
Okay, I did take a history of cities.
So maybe
yes,
that was him.
Okay,
yes, very good.
And I love that.
I would imagine. When I was thinking that, I thought probably with your background from the city and so forth. Okay, so you're here and you enjoyed the time here, obviously. And
I did.
What do you think overall of the foundation that was laid? Because you've got quite a bit of education since that we'll talk about.
When I mentioned that to a couple of people yesterday when I was before the banquet, I told them that, you know, I've been to a lot of different schools. I've had lots of different professors in my day. The history department here at Cal State, California University, was fabulous. The history, and I even took a couple political science courses. I love that too. And those courses, to this day, I tell my children that about some of those classes. I said, you know, one of the fabulous classes that I had, and it's one of these classes here for my bachelor's degree.
Did you find that through the rest of your career, education and certainly in the military and even just as a person developing, that was a major asset, the mindset, the learning process that you learned?
It was a great foundation. And I think if I had gone to a different school where you have the huge classes and that type of thing, I would not have had the same perspective on life. It was a great foundation for me.
Well, that's really good to hear. That's very nice to hear. Was there any time, did there ever come a time when particularly your history background was, you found that to be an advantage, or you used it in any particular ways?
The time that my history background was a wonderful advantage was when my little boy was watching the Liberty's Kids series on the Revolutionary War, and that child knew every single thing about the Revolution, and I took everything I had to keep up with him.
That is pretty neat.
He was amazing.
Normally we hear those things about math. Oh, they can do this and that, and I had to keep up. But that's really nice to hear that.
It was amazing. And so that really kind of regenerated my interest in the Revolutionary era. And so I would get books, and I'd test him on all the things, and he was amazing. He's 12 now, but you know, when that series came out, he
so
was
we have another
5 or 6.
historian in the making.
I think
all
so.
right, send him up here.
That's
we'll
right. But
ship
other
him
than
across
that,
the country.
I think it really was just a foundation. It helped me. That liberal arts education, I think, was wonderful for me. You know, a lot of people will major in history and go to law school.
Yes.
They don't really relate that much. It's just, I think, the way you learn to think.
It is exactly
Yeah.
right, and I'm so happy
Yeah.
to hear you say that, because that's what we try to tell people. It's not just the facts, it's the
Right.
thought process,
Yeah.
and you have done a lot there to give us a great advertisement. Maybe we'll clip this out
Good.
and it'll be part of our recruitment for our
Wonderful.
history majors. Yes, that was great. And then the next question, of course, and it's an obvious one, the leap then from being a teacher. As you said, I don't imagine too many little girls growing up in the late 60s, early 70s will sit there and think, I'm going to be a full colonel in the United States Army. What happened? Can you walk us through the process?
Well, it was right here at California University. Again, I joined the ROTC program. The way that happened was that I had read an article about women in the Army, because those were the days, this was prior to me coming here, and I started here in '74. Those were the days when lots of things were happening in the Army. And so I'd read an article. I was at the library, and I remember sitting there reading an article about women in the Army, and I thought, oh, this is very interesting. So that was that, and then I come here to go to college, and I happened upon Captain Larry Loftus walking across the campus. And this was, classes were already in play. I had already registered, and we were taking classes, and the add and drop period had already ended. But I talked to him, and I said, hey, tell me, are women able to go in ROTC now? And he said, yes, and he grabbed me and walked me over, and we added Military Science 1 to my schedule. And I said, but isn't the add period over? He says, no problem, we'll fix you right up. And now I realize that was his first semester, the first semester the ROTC started here. And he was bumping up his numbers, and he figured if somebody wanted to take MS1 where there was no contract or anything, he was going to definitely put them in.
Once again, in the context, I mean, it's fortuitous and it's historic, because from my research, 72 is the first year that they actually allow women in, and 76 is, in overall country, the first group of commissioned officers, women officers from that. So here you are in 77, and you're just right in there. You're fitting.
And they opened West Point to women in 76.
Yeah.
And I actually even thought about applying, because I thought, oh, it would be so fun to be part of the first class. But then I thought, well, I'm going to get commissioned in 77, and I really could use the money. Yeah. So I didn't. And I tell my kids, I say, you know, if I could go back, I would have applied. But I will say that me joining ROTC, and at that point, so that was freshman year, and I was just taking military science, I didn't really get too serious about it until the end of my sophomore year. And I totally surprised the ROTC people when I came up and said, I'm going to sign the contract. Because I was probably the person they would never have thought would have been oriented towards the Army. But I found something in the ROTC program. I found my own voice, in the sense that, you know, women were kind of, we were held back so many ways. And in the ROTC department, they treated everyone as a cadet. We were all cadets. We all wore the same uniform. We all had to run together. We did PT together. We were all equals as far as the ROTC professors were concerned.
I find that this fascinating, because once again, we have the two overlays in your, and I want to come back to another question, the race and the gender. Harry Truman integrates the Army as far as race in 1948. It's not until 78, 30 years later, that the Army integrates in terms of gender. And yet you're saying that from the transition almost seems seamless in terms of your experience, at least in the ROTC program.
And I will say that's one thing about the military. When the military gets an order, they obey. My dad was in whenever...
That's what I was in there. Your dad joined World War II?
Well, he joined after World War II. He's 81 this year, so he was a little young for World War II. But he joined, so he was in whenever they integrated.
That is amazing. Did you generate?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's when the... And then we face that down with hopefully, the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Once that happens, a lot of people in the military will fight and fight, fight. But when they get the order, they comply. And that's what happened with women. And so, I mean, Larry Loftus and the later colleagues of his that came along, whatever their personal beliefs may have been, and I never did notice any overt sexism, and I had noticed a lot of that in the armies, so I could kind of see it when it's there. But they knew that the Army wanted to emphasize training for women, equal training for women, and that's what we got. And it really, there weren't very many of us.
Yeah.
When I went to ROTC Advanced Camp in 1976 from Cal U, there were 2 women, and the other one dropped out within the first week at Fort Bragg. So I was the only one left, although I didn't know that. When I got back, they said, "Oh, you're it." So I did, I mean, but it really was my first opportunity with being treated as a full citizen. And so I very much embraced the Army and have ever since, obviously.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's fascinating, as again, from an historic standpoint, that positive reaction. I have another question. And when you entered the program, obviously he knew you were a woman, but did he know at that time you were African American because of what we had said earlier in the interview?
Well, no, what happened is, although I'm the type of person who will tell everyone I can, just because that makes life a lot easier. But in the military, they don't really gather a whole lot of demographic information on the non-contract people. But as soon as you become under contract, then they get everything. And so at that point, you know, I put my race down.
Yes, right.
Now, Larry was fine with it, and I think I explained it to him. But I have had occasion in the Army where some personnel specialists will see that on my form, and they will take it upon themselves to correct my race. And then I find out, and then I have to go back and have them fix it. But in the most part, I just let people know up front, and that makes life a lot easier.
Just from the talks here, you're a very open person, and I would never have thought for a second that you wouldn't have told him. My thought was that once again, what was happening during those days, and you mentioned it, the quota system, and it was a quota system for everything, on police forces in hiring in general, minorities and women. Though I never could understand how they could consider women minorities. Never made sense to me. But you know, the 2-for-1 deal with you besides having so much ability, it would seem to me that I was interested if that's what he was trying to do too.
I don't think so, because I think it really was came out of the blue to him that I actually, because I came up and I said, I'm signing up for Military Science 3, and they looked totally shocked that I would be one of the ones doing that. And because they really didn't know much, because the MS1 and MS2 students, you had a lot of folks there that would take it for credit.
Especially after the draft ended.
But they would take it for credit, and then, you know, and so out of all those MS2 students, I'm sure, even though I got decent grades, I'm sure they didn't think that I had a lot of promise. Now, one thing I did have was I could run. And so, but I really think that didn't come about until after I became a contract cadet. So I think I was just out of the blue for them.
That's fascinating. Now, you obviously were a very enthusiastic recruit. You speed up your class schedule so you can go to advanced training as a junior, and then you went to airborne?
Yeah, so I did that. I became a junior early, and then I went to advanced camp in '76, and that was the first year that women did the same training as the men. And then, but I didn't know that at the time. And then so I come back to Cal U, and now I get some respect because the other woman had washed out.
Right.
And then I told
Probably a lot of men have washed out too.
Yes, yes. And then I decided I wanted to go to airborne school, and they were like, oh, no, you can't go to airborne school. I said, well, I know they opened airborne school, because I had talked, now I made friends at other universities.
Yeah.
And they said, well, yeah, you could, I mean, you can go, but you don't want to go, because they told me I had to do 5 chin-ups from a hang. So you had to start at a dead hang and do your chin-ups. And I couldn't even do one. And so I worked and worked and worked, and finally, so they told me I could go if I could do it. So I finally could do it, and then, so I got to go to airborne school, and then of course I get to airborne school, and you really don't have to do them from a hang. But, so then when I got back from airborne school, I got so much respect.
Oh, I could imagine, yes,
Yeah.
yes. As I said, a lot of guys
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to do those, or
No.
wouldn't want to do those things,
Yeah.
jump out of a perfectly good airplane, as they
Oh,
used to
yeah,
say back
they
in
still
those
do.
days. Oh, I know. So, during the course of your military career, did you ever have use for this paratroop training?
Well, that was unfortunate, because when I was going on active duty, I really wanted to do that. I wanted to, because I was so excited about being airborne qualified. But they still had not fully integrated women into the 82nd and any of the airborne positions at that point, because I was commissioned in '77. I think they started doing that in the early '80s. So no, I didn't get a chance. And over the years, I thought, well, maybe I'll try to get, just a little, like some sort of assignment where I could even just make a few jumps. But over the years, that kind of faded, and then I started getting the aches and pains.
I was just going to say, and then good sense caught up with you finally, right?
You know what? I don't think I want to do that.
Right.
And then my husband, who's former military, he was in the 82nd, and he's made hundreds of jumps. He only spent 4 years on active duty. That was when West Point had a 4-year obligation.
Yeah.
So he went to West Point, graduated '71, spent 4 years at the 82nd, left active duty. But he's made so many jumps that he's got an artificial hip now. So I think,
made the right choice.
Yeah.
This seems like a great place
Yeah.
to transition to your military career. As I said, just like we could do hours on your early life, we could do hours here. Let's just go through here really quickly, chronologically, and then pick out a few things that I'd like to highlight about your military career. You were commissioned as a second lieutenant
Yes.
in '77.
Correct.
And then where do you go from there, and what happens?
So I went to Redstone Arsenal. Well, I first went to Fort McClellan for a officer basic course, and then I went, and we had 4 women in my officer basic course out of about 40 students. And then I went to Redstone Arsenal, which was right up the road from Fort McClellan, as a military police officer. So I was a lieutenant in a military police company. And in those days, they called it white hat duty, which was law enforcement, straight law enforcement duty. And that was as opposed to a combat military police company, which would do the, be attached to a division and do most of their combat technical military police stuff in a division. So this was just pure law enforcement, and I did that for a few years at Redstone. And then I left active duty and, and went in the reserve. Now, at that point, I went in the, I joined a unit that was, and the reason I left active duty was because I think I was bored. I had all these expectations about the military, and then I got to a unit where it was just the officers had, we lost our company commander, so he was a captain, we lost our captain, the first lieutenant took his place, we lost him, another second lieutenant took his place, he was kind of a jerk, and it was just, it wasn't what I thought. I kept thinking that the military is going to be this fabulous experience, and it was kind of, like I say, it was kind of boring. I liked the work, but the other officers were not up to what I thought was the par that they should be. So I got off active duty and I joined the reserve unit, and it was a unit with Navy, Army, and Air Force. And that's when I saw all the professional, top quality people that I knew that were in the Army or in the military. And so then I went back in, because I thought, this is, so that it really was this just particular place, not the military. And so I went back on active duty, and in those days they were starting a program called the Active Guard/Reserve program, and it was active duty, but you worked with the reserve unit, reserve or guard, and in my case it was reserve. And so I went to a military police company in West Virginia. It was a company that had a headquarters in the bowels of West Virginia, but it had a separate platoon in Wheeling. And so Wheeling being only an hour from Pittsburgh, that was perfect for me, and I had command of that organization.
How did your dad, just thought came to my mind, how did Dad feel about you being in the Army, but then also being a policeman like him?
Yeah, and I think that's probably why I chose military police.
Oh, okay.
And it was very competitive to get, especially for women. I found out later that the year that I was selected, they said there were only 2 from ROTC chosen during that period. But I do think he thought it was an honor for him that I chose that line of work. His family was very, very law enforcement oriented. He had a whole lot of brothers. 4 of them became Pittsburgh police officers. A sister became a meter maid.
Wow.
My brother's a Pittsburgh police officer. Several of my cousins are Pittsburgh police officers. And so that really meant something. And I think the fact that I became MP really, he really was proud of that.
Sure.
He's very proud of me.
Well, he should be.
Yeah,
My goodness gracious, yes.
Thank you.
So you're back in, and now you're in the military?
Yeah, I'm back on active duty, and now I had gotten married right when I was getting off active duty, and that may be part of, if I say I was kind of, I didn't think that the officers were as professional as I thought, and then I was getting married, and then I was going to be a mother, and so all of that played into it too. But I did miss it, so I came back on active duty.
After your child was
Yes, she was born in 1980, and I came back on in 81, although I was still in the reserve. So I was telling somebody about the maternity uniforms. They didn't even have maternity uniforms.
Was up in 70, up till 75, they kicked you out.
Right.
You weren't even allowed.
So here we were, so I was pregnant on active duty, and we would wear the name tag. And then you could wear your civilian clothes and a name tag. So she was born in 80. I came back on in January of 81.
That was a question I would have never thought to ask you about maternity clothes.
I know, but it really was interesting because, okay, so she, with her, no maternity uniform. Yep. The next child was born in 82. And by then we had a cute little, so you had these maternity pants or a skirt, and then you had a blouse like this, but it had a tunic over it, so you would unbutton the buttons as you progressed, and so you'd have this blouse on underneath with your buttons all open. And that was their version of a maternity uniform, so that was her. And then the next one, by then we started getting real maternity uniforms. But, you think about something like that, the Army just wasn't ready. But anyway, so I took command of that. It was a detachment, so I had command of that, and then from there I went to the Officer Advanced course at Fort McClellan again, military police. And that course, again, about 40 officers, we only had 2 women. But interestingly, because you have more attrition, I think, with the women, down the hall we had officer basic courses coming through, and those had about 15 women per course. So we could see things changing. And then after that I went to recruiting command. I commanded a recruiting company in Chicago. And then I was supposed to go to Panama, but I happened to meet a female general at a banquet with recruiting command, and I thought, well, since I'm a female, I'm the only other female officer in the room, I probably should go up and say something. So I did, and she asked me where I was going. I told her I was going to Panama, and this was right before the Noriega thing. Yeah. I would have been down in Panama during this Noriega thing, but she said, I have a premier assignment for you, because unbeknownst to me, Texas A&M needed a female officer because they have a uniformed Corps of Cadets, and they had at that time a segregated women's outfit, and they needed a female, and so she nabbed me, and so I ended up at Texas A&M. And then when I got there, I was there for 3 years, and I met my now husband, and he talked me into getting off active duty and going to law school. So That's how I ended up.
And then you've been in the reserves.
So I've been in the reserve, yeah.
And you've been part of the Judge Advocate General.
Yeah. After law school, what you do is you apply for, it's a new appointment. You don't branch transfer. So I had a new appointment to the JAG Corps. You don't lose any time in service or anything like that, but you, at that point, there's a severance. You sever your relationship with the military police, and now you have this appointment in the JAG Corps. And so once I became a JAG, then I took all the reserve JAG assignments, and then I did some active duty here and there. I did active duty at Fort Hood, at Fort Sam Houston, just with the JAG Corps, because when you're a lawyer in the Army as a captain, you learn your skills. I was not a captain in the JAG Corps. I was a major. I came in as a major, and so I wanted to get all those skills. So I did some active duty here and there, even as a major, to try to catch up. And so that really worked for me because I was able to take trial defense jobs where we defend their. Anytime a soldier gets in trouble, they're entitled to an attorney. Sure. And so I did a lot of that. And whenever, again, fortuitously for me, we in the Army created a separate trial defense organization in the reserve. The active duty I'd already had it. It took us about 15 years later to get this. And so once we had that, I was able to take one of the commands of a very large trial defense organization in the Army. And then after I did that, my last year in the Army, I spent on active duty as the chief of the Trial Defense Service, and that's a top job for an Army colonel, for an active duty Army colonel, and I was able to do it as a reserve officer. So,
you, as a result of those assignments, I saw your record. You did spend time back and forth overseas, huh? You had to go into the combat zones.
Well, as the chief of Trial Defense Service, we have lawyers all over the world.
Right.
So even people in the combat zones get in trouble and need lawyers. And so we have offices in Iraq and Afghanistan and Kosovo. And so as the chief of trial defense, I went everywhere that my attorneys were. So I went all over the world, including those combat zones.
And you mainly handled defense work from what I saw.
Yeah. That's my love. And of course, being a military police officer, to be a defense attorney.
That's what clicked in my mind.
Right,
I would have seen you on the prosecutorial
Right, you would think so. But I also have, at my bottom, a respect for the disadvantaged. And I definitely believe in our system, our legal system, and that everyone needs a defense. And so I'm very, very loyal to the defense of, especially our soldiers.
That's what they say. Everybody hates lawyers until you need one.
That's right.
I mean, and so yeah, that's very nice that you are there. Yeah, and you found that obviously fulfilling, that type of work. While we're on this, it seems like you found when you talk about being a lawyer, that love of your life in terms of, but you have so much education, and you have so many master's degrees. Could you talk me through why you opted to do all those things? I find that fascinating as a teacher.
Well, I think the first master's degree, that was my MBA, I got from Wheeling. It was Wheeling College when I went. Now it's Wheeling Jesuit University. Yeah. And that was because in the Army always tells people, you really should get a master's degree. It makes you a better thinker. It makes you more of an asset to the military. And so they only had a degree, an MBA that they offered, and I was stationed in Wheeling. And so I thought, I can do this. Even though I didn't have a business background, I had to take calculus and statistics and economics and accounting just to get in.
Oh, yeah.
I know.
That's for a history major, boy. That's a major.
But I thought, I can do this.
Well,
and so
yeah, you did.
I did, even though it was very challenging, especially the calculus, because I took calculus from a guy who didn't speak English very well, and I could not understand anything he said. And this was back in the days of blackboards, and he would write everything on 3 blackboards. And I would just write everything down, go home, and I spent 20 hours a week teaching myself calculus. But it was that sense of accomplishment that I can do anything. And that's something that I learned early on in my ROTC days, that I can do things I never thought I could ever do. Jumping out of airplanes, outrunning all the guys. I can do what I want to do. And so I was not going to accept defeat on this, this MBA. So I ended up getting that. And so then, of course, as far as the Army is concerned, well, you've done everything you need to do, a master's, and you're set. But when I was stationed at Texas A&M, since I was on the faculty there as an assistant professor, you can take classes pretty much for free. They were $17 a credit.
Yeah, right.
And I thought, well, that's such a waste if I don't take advantage of that. And so I took classes in there and got a master's in public administration, which I thought was more relevant to me anyway. And then the other master's degree is from the United States Army War College. And that's
just a second before we get to that.
Okay.
I want to follow up a question on that. Were you anticipating a post-military career in something like a public administration?
I knew I was going to go to law school after the Army.
Okay.
I just did that. The MPA was because I do like to learn. I like to learn.
Yeah.
And I thought it would be such a waste not to take advantage of this free degree. But the Master's in Strategic Studies was that if you go to the War College, they're accredited, you get the master's degree. And so
if I have my chronology right, once again, it's another milestone that your career coincides with that. In '94, through the an edict of the Secretary of Defense, women were allowed in or near combat zones. The language is so legalistic that I don't know, but it was like he lowered the risk situation. So in effect, women were allowed to, and that coincided around the time that you went into this. Did that have any impact, or was it, it was just a coincidence?
That was just coincidence. The Army has, I think, not been totally honest about, the Army knew that women were doing combat type work back in Panama. I mean, women, the military police that were in Panama, there were female military police officers, female military police enlisted, that were doing what we would consider combat action. Even now, the Army says, well, we don't have women in the combat arms. But as we all know, women are in combat situations. That's right. That's right. And so shouldn't say it's not that the Army's being honest, but I don't think the Army has gotten to the point where it's willing to go to Congress and say, look, here's the situation. There's no more front lines. We can't draw a line anymore and say, okay, women aren't going to go up here, or any units that are up here. It's not even possible. And Congress, same way. They don't want to address the issue, and so we have this status quo that, you know, we all know that women are in harm's way, and the Army's been that way for a while.
See, as I was doing the research, I wasn't, you know, I'm glad for your insight, but it was seeming to me I was getting some kind of inconsistency there about when they would allow women. First of all, they weren't allowed to train with weapons, and then women were allowed to carry pistols, and all this like always a halfway kind of measure thing, without acquiescing to the fact, as you said, that people were like really in danger. But back to the original question, it was the opportunity to go to the War College, which was another sort of a military accomplishment, and not necessarily coincidental, because you never really planned any career in any sort of military strategy or combat.
No,
I mean,
the War College, even though they will send JAG officers to the War College, they know that, you know, we're not going to be the ones writing the theater campaign plans. Right. But they do want lawyers to know how to do that, because we are the ones who are going to give advice to the commanders in that kind of situation.
That's another insight that I wouldn't have got. So that's really fascinating. So and by then you already had your law degree and were practicing, so this was sort of just another kind of icing and another thing on that.
And also, to make general officer, you have to have the War College.
Yes.
And so I was on track to make general officer, and so you know, I needed to do the War College. And so when I got selected for War College, I knew that was, okay, so now I'm on track. As it turned out, I did not get selected to become a general officer. But I do attribute that to partly that we have only 2 reserve JAG general officers, and they each have tenure for a certain period of time, and my time in the shoot to not coincide with the openings. Otherwise, I think I did have a pretty good shot.
Well, yeah, it would seem like with all your record and everything, and it is sometimes, I guess, just being in the right place, the right time, and we all.
Oh, not to undersell the folks that are doing it, but
No.
with only you only have a few opportunities. It's not like the infantry where they might have 300 general officers, and so you have a little better chance. With the JAG, we have 2.
Does that kind of influence your decision that it was time to retire from that
Oh, I
military
would not have retired. But what happens is if you're a colonel, you can stay for 30 years.
Right.
And then they
Yeah.
give you the boot, and it was called a mandatory removal date.
Okay.
So I hit my mandatory removal date, but I was on active duty. So I was able to stay 31 years because they give you an exception if they mobilized you. So they give you the time of the mobilization, and then they give you a little time on the end to sort through your affairs.
In the time we have left, I'd like to touch on something just a little bit more personal, but I don't see how it can be in any way separated from your military career, and that's your family. To me, raising 5 children would take a tremendous amount of courage and effort and a full-time job in and of itself, and that you did that in conjunction with doing all these other things, all the going to school and defending your country and defending soldiers that got in trouble and everything else. Could you tell, obviously, your children have inherited your love of education. Your oldest child has just received a PhD. That's fascinating. Could you tell me a little bit about your kids? And in particular, again, the personal part is, we already touched on some of it with the pregnancy close, about how you managed to juggle that with your military career.
I think that my idea, when I went into the Army, the role models that we younger women had been in the Women's Army Corps, and they didn't have the advantages of getting married or having children or anything like that. And so we were forging new ground. But I grew up in the women's movement too. While I was here at Cal U, there was an active women's movement group. Now that I remember, I can't remember the name of it, but I was involved in that, and it was the "we can do anything" thing. You remember the lady who brings home the bacon and fries it up in the pan, and she's wearing her business suit? Well,
Helen Redding.
Yeah, so I thought I could do anything, and so I did not want to fall into a stereotype of I had to not have children, not marry, not wear makeup. I wanted to be, I could be a woman, but also be an officer. And so I decided that I was going to live my life. And I had been, of course, having children as part of that. Now, luckily for me, the Army had reached the point where you can have children in the Army. And so I had the 2 children, and my husband then didn't really want more children. I always wanted more children. After we divorced, then my new husband, he didn't have children, and so I thought, oh, great, we can have children. We'll have 2 more, and so we agreed we were going to have 4 children. And then we had the surprise 5th.
The second husband is the man that you were referring to, who was the military.
Yes.
Who graduated from West Point, and you met him while you were
while I was teaching at Texas A&M.
He's a professor.
Yes.
In what?
He's a political scientist.
Okay.
He's at the Bush School. They have the George Bush School
Yes.
of Public Affairs and Government and Public Affairs, or Government Public Service at Texas A&M. And he's still at Texas A&M. We live in Austin, which is 2 hours away, but he teaches a couple days a week, and so he'll work at home the other days. So yeah, we have 3 children together, and then I have 2 children from my first marriage.
And that there's such divergent ages. I mean, you said you have one now, and you have one just got a PhD, and you have one that's in 6th grade.
That's right.
So that must be a challenge.
Well, the older children were very helpful with the younger children. And I did go to law school. Well, Nicole was 10 and Michelle was 8 when I remarried. And then I knew I wanted to get pregnant right away. So I got off active duty, go to law school. Actually, I was on active duty in law school when the Gulf War started. And my ETS date, the expiration term of service date, was October 15th. If my ETS date had been October 30th, I would have been stop-lost. And so I was so lucky because I had given up. I had turned down Command and General Staff College. I was accepted. I turned it down. I said, getting out. I'm going to law school. I'm sitting in law school when all that happened.
Yeah.
So, but I was also pregnant. I got pregnant so that I could have that child at the end of my first year of law school. And that she came right on schedule. And then the next plan was to get pregnant my third year and then have that child right after. And then
really
he came right on schedule.
Woman you are. I keep it on a schedule like that.
That's right. So that worked out great.
Yes.
And the older children were a lot of help. They had to move around a little bit when they were young. But this worked so nice for them that I got off active duty because they were able to have friends.
Oh, sure.
And then the younger children were able to live in the same area. So.
And then the youngest one you alluded to was a surprise. Were you still on reserves, or were you? Were you?
Actually, I was still in reserve status. But after he was born, I took a tour, active duty tour at Fort Hood. So I remember driving up there. It's about 70 miles from our house, so I would go up every day because I was breastfeeding. And I would do the breast pump in the car at lunchtime.
Maybe one of the first times in an interview I've ever had anybody mention that. This is groundbreaking. This is really good.
You can buy the kind with the battery thing.
That's good for his future historians there, so they'll be able to look this up.
Actually, on that subject, this is a funny story. I had, in the old days, when I was breastfeeding Michelle, who's my second daughter, so she was born in 1981, you didn't have the portable breast pumps that they have now.
And you wouldn't dare talk about something like this back in those days.
Oh my gosh. Well, I went to a hospital supply store and rented a big breast pump, which is what they had in hospitals. Because nobody had, they didn't come up with these things for working women yet. And so I'm going to a 2-week course, and I want to pump the milk so that I can still keep my supply up while I'm gone. And so I get off the airplane, and I'm carrying this big, it looks like I have a generator. And so I was a captain or a lieutenant. And this major, he's like, oh, can I help you carry your stuff? And so he carries this breast pump. And so he carries it all the way for me. And then at the end, he says, so tell me, what was that anyway? Some sort of generator? I said, oh, it's a breast pump. He turned 20 shades of red.
Oh, I would imagine. That's what I said.
And I saw him years later at Fort Riley, years later, and he sees me and he says, you're the breast pump lady.
And that anecdote itself tells us a heck of a lot about the way things and values have changed. Right. It's just incredible, incredible. So your children grew up with, from what you're telling me, without that typical Army brat kind of a situation. So you were able to give them a sense of stability along with doing all this service to your country. As I said, what accomplishments.
Well, I'm very proud of them, and they are proud of me because my daughter, Michelle, she emailed me last night. She said, oh, I'm so proud of you. And, I forget about that. I don't even think about that very much. But, yeah, they really are.
We all tend to do that with our families. Yeah. By the way, what rank was Daddy when he got out of the service?
He was a captain.
Oh, good. So Mommy outranks Daddy, so you can pull that on him, too.
That doesn't really work very well.
Not with an airborne.
I try.
That's what I was going to say, airborne. Different mentality there.
He developed a salute for me. And we have a pool, and so one day he was so mad at me about something because he thinks I give orders when, of course, as a mother, you just really are running the household. Well, he flipped upside down in the pool, and then he did this. So that was his salute for me.
Amazing.
It's pretty funny.
Stories. Absolutely. Absolutely. Once again, like I said, the changes in relationships between husband and wives and so many different kind of things. What are you doing now with your life in retirement?
Well, I'm retired from the Army, but I am working with the Department of Veterans Affairs as an attorney in procurement law, and I never did procurement law at all. I have supervised attorneys who've done contracts for the Army. I supervised the administrative law office, and we had contracts as part of that. But that's completely different than what I'm doing with the VA. And so I'm learning. I'm on a learning curve. I've been doing that now for about 18 months, and it's a new world. We have federal acquisition regulation that's about that thick, and it would be like never doing tax, and then all of a sudden now you have all the income tax regulations. And so you really, it's an intellectual challenge. It really is. And the reason I took that job, I was very happy in another job I had actually I was working for the Army as a civilian because I got to help soldiers. But this job is 10 minutes from my house, and it pays more, and at this point I thought I'd better focus on my family a little bit more.
Well, you seem to have done that, kept that balance very, very well in terms of focusing on your family. We've talked to veterans, and they're deployed, and you know, everything that they go through, but you've done seemed a remarkable job there. I was just going to ask if there was a lot of traveling in this job, so it doesn't seem...
Yeah, this job, no. Now,
great.
My last job in the Army, I was gone all the time.
Yeah.
And I was mobilized, so I was already gone, and then as part of that, I traveled all over. So I'm actually enjoying not having to travel.
I would, yes,
Yeah.
after I've done all this. So when's your book coming out? Have you started on it yet?
My daughter, the daughter who just got a PhD, she always says, "Mom, you should do your memoir." She's a memoirist.
Yeah.
She says, "You should do your memoir," and I thought, oh my gosh. I always thought my mother should do a memoir.
Well, our parents should, right? That's true. But now
right.
you're the mother, so you need to do it just exactly correct.
So maybe someday I'll get with her.
Well, I'm urging you to do that as an historian. Your story, and as I said, especially when we overlay it against the backdrop of so many changes that were going on, is just enlightens a lot of perspectives. Are there any other anecdotes or any other philosophy you would like to share with us? As that's kind of putting you on a spot, I know, but I always like to sort of finish up the interview with that in case there's something I've overlooked or there's something you would like to share.
One thing I'm very proud of, and that was when I told you that I got to Texas A&M and they were still segregated. The women were segregated in their own unit. They had a women's unit for the Army and Navy, because that has all services there. They had a corps at that time of 3,500 cadets. And then they had a unit for the Air Force. And I was the tactical advisor for the Army unit, W1. Those women looked to me to make changes. And I was only a captain, and I worked for a lieutenant colonel, and my ultimate boss was a colonel. And my colonel did not want women to be integrated into the corps. But I saw it, not only the fact that segregation was wrong and that was something that we're not doing on active duty, but it also limited the leadership roles. So if you were a woman in W1, you only had one opportunity to be first sergeant, one opportunity to be commander, and so you could only have one woman at a time. And so I talked to my supervisors about that. They thought they didn't see anything wrong because they had all gone to Texas A&M. That's the way it was when they were there. And finally, I was not able to get anywhere with my chain of command, which is what the Army teaches you. You go to your chain of command. And so I was appointed to the Faculty Senate on the status of women, a subcommittee. And so I talked to them, and I got them fired up. And then, of course, that helped because they made resolution that we needed to go this way. And then I went to the newspaper, the local paper. Oh, wow. And my colonel was so mad at me.
That wouldn't have been
He had me standing at attention, and he's yelling and screaming, "You will never talk to the press." But he didn't know, because I had given them the backstory, and I had given them some on-the-record stuff so that he wouldn't figure out that I was the one who gave the backstory. And he said, "Did you say this? Did you say this?" And I said, "Yes, this is the stuff that was on the record." And he says, "You will never talk to them again." I can't imagine if he knew I gave him the rest of that.
Yeah, right.
And he told me, "They will never be in my old unit." Well, they're in his old unit today. And so that's something that I looked at as the women there, they relied on me, and I felt that I had to come through for them.
You did.
And I did, so I'm very proud of that.
Well, you have the right to be proud of so many things. This has been one of the most pleasant and fascinating interviews I've ever done. I thank you for being with us here today. I thank you for representing Cal U so magnificently, and I thank you so much for your service to your country.
Thank you very much.
We are really blessed to have people like you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.